The cry pierced through the cabin like a siren that wouldn't quit. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pressing noise-canceling headphones tighter against their ears, others shooting irritated glances toward first class where the wailing originated. Flight 227 from Seattle to Miami had been airborne for barely an hour, and already the tension was thick enough to cut with a plastic knife. Marcus Wellington sat rigid in seat 2A, his $1,000 suit wrinkled, his carefully maintained composure crumbling with each desperate sob from his 8-month-old daughter. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he bounced little Emma against his shoulder, her tiny face red and swollen from crying. He'd tried everything: the bottle, the pacifier, the stuffed giraffe that usually worked like magic. Nothing. His assistant had quit 2 days ago, his wife had left him 6 months prior, and his nanny had called in sick that morning. For the first time in his meticulously organized life, Marcus Wellington, CEO of Wellington Industries, was completely, utterly alone with a problem his money couldn't solve. "Sir, is everything all right?" The flight attendant appeared beside him, her professional smile strained. Behind her, Marcus could feel the weight of dozens of eyes, could hear the whispered complaints, the exasperated sighs. His daughter's cries only intensified, her little fists beating against his chest as if angry at him for not understanding what she needed. "I'm sorry," Marcus muttered, the words foreign on his tongue. He wasn't used to apologizing. "She won't stop. I don't know what's wrong." The flight attendant offered some lukewarm suggestions he'd already tried, then retreated, leaving Marcus to face the judgment of his fellow passengers alone. He caught sight of a businessman in 3C rolling his eyes, a woman in 4B shaking her head. Shame burned in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since childhood, since before he'd built his empire, before he'd learned to insulate himself from the world with wealth and status. Emma's cries grew more frantic, more desperate, and Marcus felt his own panic rising to match hers. What kind of father was he? What kind of man couldn't comfort his own child? 30 rows back in the cramped quarters of economy class, Sarah Mitchell listened to the distant crying with a familiar ache in her chest. She was wedged into seat 32 billions, her knees pressed against the seat in front of her, her 8-year-old son Daniel sleeping peacefully against the window. They were heading to Miami for her mother's surgery, a trip she could barely afford even with the budget airline tickets she'd hunted for weeks to find. Her wallet held exactly $47 to last them the next 3 days, but as she listened to that baby cry, money was the furthest thing from her mind. She knew that sound. She'd lived through countless nights of it with Daniel, walking the floors of their tiny apartment, singing softly, trying everything to soothe a colicky infant while working 2 jobs and studying for her nursing degree. She'd been alone then, too, abandoned by a man who'd decided fatherhood wasn't for him, left to figure out the impossible puzzle of motherhood with no instruction manual and no support system. The crying continued, growing more desperate, more exhausted. Sarah glanced at Daniel, still sleeping soundly, then made a decision that defied all logic and social convention. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The walk from row 32 to row 2 felt like miles. Passengers stared as she passed, this woman in discount jeans and a faded sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, heading toward first class like she belonged there. A flight attendant moved to intercept her, but Sarah held up a gentle hand. "I think I can help," she said simply. The attendant hesitated, glanced toward the front of the plane where the crying hadn't ceased, and stepped aside. Marcus looked up through exhausted eyes as a stranger appeared beside his seat. She wasn't glamorous, wasn't the type of woman who usually occupied his world of boardrooms and charity galas, but her eyes held something he recognized in that moment. Understanding without judgment. "May I?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over Emma's cries. Marcus's first instinct was pride, was to refuse, to insist he could handle his own daughter. But the words died on his lips as Emma let out another heartbroken wail. He nodded, helpless. Sarah didn't take the baby immediately. Instead, she knelt beside Marcus's seat, bringing herself to eye level with a tiny, distraught child. She began to hum, low and melodic, a tune that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient. It was the song Sarah's grandmother had taught her, the one she'd sung to Daniel on the hardest nights, the one that had never failed to bring comfort. Emma's crying faltered just for a moment. Sarah reached out slowly, letting the baby see her hand, letting her decide. Then, with Marcus's exhausted permission, she lifted Emma into her arms. What happened next would be talked about by every passenger on that flight for years to come. Sarah didn't just hold the baby, she moved with her, swaying in a rhythm that seemed to match some unheard music, her humming continuous and soothing. She pressed Emma against her chest, the baby's ear positioned right over her heartbeat. She walked the aisle of first class with confidence, as if she'd paid for that seat, as if she had every right to be there. And slowly, impossibly, Emma's cries began to fade. Within 5 minutes, the baby was whimpering softly. Within 10, she was quiet, her tiny fist curled against Sarah's collarbone. Within 15, she was asleep, her breathing deep and even. The cabin, which had been tense with irritation, seemed to exhale collectively. But Sarah didn't return Emma immediately. She continued to walk, continued to sway, making sure the baby was truly settled. She knew how quickly they could wake, how fragile that sleep could be in those early months. Marcus watched in stunned silence. He'd seen his daughter settled by nannies, by his ex-wife, but never like this. Never with such natural grace, such intuitive understanding. When Sarah finally made her way back to his seat, he stood awkwardly, unsure of the protocol for this situation. His world was transactions and negotiations, not genuine human kindness from strangers who expected nothing in return. "How did you—" he began, his voice hoarse. "I have a son," Sarah said softly, carefully transferring the sleeping Emma back to her father's arms. "He had colic. Many nights like this. Sometimes babies just need a different heartbeat, a different rhythm. She's beautiful, by the way." Marcus looked down at his daughter, peaceful at last, and felt something crack in his chest. "Thank you," he managed, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. Sarah smiled, started to turn away, to return to her cramped seat in economy and her own sleeping child. "Wait," Marcus said. The word came out sharper than he intended, a command rather than a request. He softened his tone. "Please, what's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Marcus Wellington." He shifted Emma carefully, reached for his wallet with his free hand. "Let me thank you properly. I can—" "No." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "That's not necessary. Really, but Marcus faltered. In his world, everything had a price. Everything was a transaction. He didn't know how to accept a gift freely given, didn't know how to be in someone's debt without immediately paying it off. "Please, let me do something." Sarah glanced back toward economy, toward the son waiting for her. "If you really want to do something, hold her like this." She demonstrated the position, with her ear against your heart. "Sing to her. It doesn't matter if you think you can't sing. She doesn't care about pitch. She just wants to know you're there, that she's safe. That's what babies need. Not things, just presence." With that, she walked away, disappearing through the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane, from the rest of the world. Marcus stood holding his daughter for a long moment, processing what had just happened. Around him, the other first-class passengers were settling back into their expensive comfort, returning to their laptops and their cocktails. But Marcus couldn't move. He looked down at Emma, still sleeping peacefully, and very carefully lowered himself back into his seat. He tried what Sarah had taught him, positioning Emma's ear over his heart. He felt ridiculous at first, but then he began to hum, quietly, self-consciously. Emma stirred slightly, then settled deeper into sleep, her tiny hand curling around his finger. Something shifted in Marcus in that moment. Some wall he'd built, some armor he'd worn for so long he'd forgotten it was there, began to crack. When the flight landed in Miami 3 hours later, Marcus made a decision. He asked the flight attendant for Sarah's seat number, then waited by the gate exit, Emma sleeping in her carrier, looking more peaceful than she had in weeks. Sarah emerged with Daniel carrying their single shared backpack and stopped short when she saw Marcus waiting. "I need to know where you're staying in Miami," Marcus said without preamble. Sarah's expression turned wary, Mr. Wellington, I really don't think— My company owns the Ocean View Grand, he interrupted. I'm putting you and your son in a suite for the duration of your stay. And before you say no, know that it's sitting empty anyway. I'm not paying anything extra. I'm just offering you space that would otherwise go unused. It was a lie. The hotel was fully booked. But Marcus Wellington hadn't built an empire without learning how to make things happen. Sarah started to refuse, but Daniel tugged on her sleeve. Mom, did you hear that? A suite! Please? She looked at her son's excited face. Thought about the discount motel she'd booked 3 miles from the hospital. Thought about how tired she already was from the flight and from the weight of worry about her mother's surgery. She thought about pride and about practicality and about the grace of accepting kindness when it was offered. Okay, she said finally. Thank you. But Marcus wasn't done. Over the next 3 days, while Sarah's mother underwent surgery and recovery, Marcus found himself seeking out this woman who'd helped him. He sent meals to the hospital where Sarah kept vigil. He arranged for Daniel to have access to the hotel's kids club so Sarah could focus on her mother. He showed up at the hospital with coffee, not because he wanted anything, but because he found he genuinely cared. For the first time in years, Marcus stepped out of his world of transactions and into something more complicated, more human. He hired Sarah's mother the best post-surgical care. He arranged for Sarah's return flight to be upgraded. And when Sarah protested, when she told him it was too much, he found himself telling her the truth. You gave me something on that plane, he said. You showed me what it means to help someone without expecting anything in return. You showed me how to be present for my daughter. That's worth more than any of this. On the final day of Sarah's trip, Marcus made her an offer. His company needed a director of community outreach, someone who understood what real people needed, someone with genuine compassion and practical wisdom. The salary was more than Sarah made in a year. The benefits included full health care, college savings for Daniel, and flexible hours so she could be present for her son. Sarah stared at him across the hotel lobby, Daniel playing in the fountain nearby, and shook her head in wonder. You're offering me a job because I helped with your baby on a plane? I'm offering you a job because you reminded me what matters, Marcus corrected, and because in the 3 days I've watched you manage your mother's care, support your son, and still find time to check on Emma and me, I've seen exactly the kind of person I want in my company. Someone who leads with compassion. Someone who sees people, not transactions. Sarah took the job. She moved to Seattle 6 weeks later, into an apartment Marcus's company helped her find, enrolled Daniel in a good school, and brought her mother out to live nearby. She threw herself into the work, creating programs that actually helped people, that made Wellington Industries about more than just profit margins. Marcus, for his part, learned to be a father. He cut back his hours. He sang to Emma, held her against his heartbeat, showed up for the small moments he'd always missed before. He hired Sarah to overhaul his company's parental leave policies, to create on-site childcare, to make his business a place where humanity mattered as much as productivity. 2 years later, on the anniversary of that flight, Marcus hosted a company dinner. He stood at the podium with Emma, now a walking, talking toddler, beside him, and told the story of the plane, of the stranger who'd helped him, of the lesson he'd learned about the difference between the cost of things and their actual value. Sarah Mitchell did the unthinkable that day, he said, looking at her across the room. She saw someone struggling and helped without asking for anything in return. She showed me that real wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in presence, in compassion, in the willingness to step across the artificial lines we draw between ourselves and others. She changed my life and my daughter's life, and through the work she's done here, she's changed countless others. The room erupted in applause, but Sarah wasn't thinking about recognition or praise. She was thinking about that moment on the plane, about the decision to stand up and walk forward, about how one small act of kindness had cascaded into something neither of them could have predicted. After the dinner, after the speeches and the celebration, Marcus found Sarah on the balcony overlooking the city. Emma was asleep against his shoulder, exactly as she'd been that day on the plane. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. For that day, for this job, for showing me how to be better. Sarah smiled, thinking about her son thriving in school, about her mother healthy and nearby, about the work she was doing that actually mattered. Thank you for being willing to learn. Not everyone would have been. Below them, the city lights spread out like a constellation, each point representing a life, a story, a moment of connection or loss or transformation. Somewhere out there, on another plane, another train, another street corner, someone was crying, struggling, drowning in a moment they couldn't handle alone. And somewhere out there, Sarah liked to believe, someone else was standing up, stepping forward, choosing compassion over comfort, connection over convenience. The unthinkable wasn't really unthinkable at all. It was simply human, the choice to help, to care, to bridge the distances between us with kindness. And in a world that too often celebrated wealth and status and individual achievement, maybe that was the most revolutionary act of all. Marcus adjusted his daughter against his shoulder, her steady breathing a reminder of that desperate day when nothing had worked, when his money and power had meant nothing in the face of genuine human need. Emma stirred, murmured something in her sleep, and Marcus began to hum that same low melody Sarah had sung. And in that moment, under the stars and city lights, two people who should never have crossed paths in the rigid structure of the world, a millionaire and a struggling single mother, stood together as friends, as reminders that the barriers between us are always more fragile than we think, always more easily crossed with a simple act of compassion. The plane had landed long ago, but the journey it had started was still unfolding, still teaching them both what it meant to be truly wealthy in the ways that actually mattered.